There was a time when being average required something of you. When meeting the basic standard demanded effort, skill, and character. When simply keeping pace meant you had to bring your full self to whatever you did. That time is gone. Look around you. Really look. What do you see? A world where the bar has been lowered so far that it barely exists at all. Where excellence has become so rare that mere competence gets celebrated like genius. Where showing up on time with your shirt tucked in makes you stand out from the crowd. This isn't about judgment. This is about recognition. Clear-eyed awareness of the reality we now face. We exist in an age of collapsing standards. And in this environment, you have a choice that will define not just who you become, but what legacy you leave behind. What mark you make on a world desperately in need of men who refuse to be defined by the crumbling benchmarks around them. Will you sink to the new normal, or will you rise to become the uncommon man? The uncommon man isn't a myth from the past, isn't some relic of bygone eras when men carved civilization from wilderness, built cathedrals stone by stone, or charged beaches under withering fire. He walks among us today, moves through the same world you do, faces the same dropping standards, the same weakening expectations, the same vanishing benchmarks. But he's made a different choice. A choice to measure himself not against what surrounds him, but against what's possible. Not against his contemporaries, but against his potential. Not against current fashion, but against timeless principle. This choice isn't easy. It's not comfortable. It's not the path of least resistance beckoning from every direction in modern life. It's the uphill road, the heavy weight, the path of deliberate challenge and chosen difficulty when everything around you whispers, take it easy, do less, no one will notice, everyone else is. The voices aren't wrong about one thing. Most people won't notice, at least not immediately, because true excellence has become so rare that many have forgotten what it looks like, have lost the reference point for what humans are actually capable of achieving, creating, becoming when they refuse to be defined by dropping standards. But here's what the voices don't tell you. You'll notice, you'll know. You'll feel the difference in your bones, in your heart, in your soul, when you make the uncommon choice day after day, decision after decision, moment after moment. And eventually, even in a world of collapsing standards, the results become impossible to ignore. The gap becomes too wide to miss. The contrast becomes so stark that even those who've forgotten what excellence looks like can see that whatever you're doing, however you're living, whatever you're creating exists in a different category altogether. This is the path of the uncommon man, the journey that begins with a simple but life-changing choice, to measure yourself against what's possible rather than what's common. But how does one actually walk this path? How do you rise above mediocrity when everything around you celebrates the bare minimum? How do you become uncommon in an age that worships the average? It starts with a mental shift so fundamental that it changes everything that follows. Stop looking sideways and start looking upward. Most men today are trapped in constant comparison to those around them. They measure their success against their peers, their status against their neighbors, their achievements against their colleagues. And in an age of collapsing standards, this sideways measurement creates a deadly trap. Because when everyone around you is doing the bare minimum, just slightly outpacing them can feel like excellence. Just barely edging ahead can seem like significant achievement. Just marginally outperforming can appear like meaningful success. The uncommon man breaks this trap completely. He stops looking sideways at those around him and starts looking upward toward what's possible, toward the height of his potential, toward the summit of his capability. This upward focus changes everything, transforms how you see yourself, your work, your relationships, your entire existence. Because you're no longer bound by the limitations of those who happen to share your time and space. You're no longer defined by the shrinking expectations of a culture that expects and celebrates less with each passing year. You're measured against something both more demanding and more inspiring, your own highest possibility. This isn't abstract philosophy. It's practical psychology that produces concrete results. Because when you shift from sideways comparison to upward focus, several things happen simultaneously. You stop making excuses based on what others consider acceptable, because you're no longer using them as your benchmark. You quit settling for good enough by cultural standards, because you're aiming for what's possible, not what's passable. You cease being satisfied with better than average effort, because average itself has lost all meaning as a measuring stick for your choices. This mental shift from sideways to upward becomes the foundation for everything that follows. The essential first step that makes all other steps possible on the path to becoming truly uncommon in a world drowning in mediocrity. But mental shift alone, while necessary, isn't sufficient. It must be followed by something equally essential. Daily decisions that defy the downward pull. Look carefully at how uncommon men spend their days, at the small choices that fill their hours, at the moment-by-moment decisions that shape their weeks, months, years. What you'll find isn't occasional heroism or rare bursts of extraordinary effort. What you'll discover is consistent resistance against the gravitational pull of lowered standards through daily choices that run directly counter to the path of least resistance. When others hit snooze, they rise. When others cut corners, they complete. When others seek shortcuts, they master fundamentals. When others make excuses, they own outcomes. When others blame circumstances, they find solutions. When others pursue comfort, they embrace necessary challenge. None of these individual decisions appears remarkable in isolation. None stands out as obviously heroic or clearly defining in the moment it's made. But together, accumulated day after day, linked together into unbroken chains of uncommon choice, they create a gap between what's normal and what's possible that eventually becomes unbridgeable by those unwilling to make the same daily commitments to defying the downward pull. This isn't about perfection. The uncommon man doesn't make the harder choice every single time without fail, doesn't maintain flawless resistance against downward pressure without occasional lapse, doesn't sustain perfect alignment with highest potential without momentary deviation, but his balance of decisions tilts so heavily toward the upward path, so consistently toward the harder choice, so reliably toward resistance against mediocrity, that the cumulative effect places him in entirely different territory than those who make the easier choice most of the time while occasionally stretching toward something better. The math is simple but brutal. If you choose the harder path even 10% more often than those around you, the gap between you and them becomes unbridgeable surprisingly quickly. If you resist the downward pull even slightly more consistently than others, you'll find yourself in territory they cannot reach without changing their own decision patterns as fundamentally as you've changed yours. This daily defiance of the downward pull must then be supported by the third essential element of becoming truly uncommon, finding your few. Even the strongest man cannot indefinitely resist the gravitational pull of collapsing standards completely alone, cannot endlessly swim against the current of mediocrity without others who share his commitment to the uncommon path, cannot perpetually maintain upward momentum without a tribe, however small, that reinforces rather than undermines his defiance of the downward pull. Look at any truly uncommon man, and you'll find he's surrounded himself with a carefully chosen few who share his rejection of collapsing standards, who mirror his commitment to what's possible over what's easy, who reflect his dedication to excellence regardless of what the surrounding culture celebrates or tolerates. These connections aren't about excluding others or claiming superiority. They're about creating protected space where higher standards can be maintained, supported, and strengthened regardless of what's happening in the broader environment. Because the truth most won't acknowledge is this: we become like those we surround ourselves with. Not because we're weak, but because we're human. Not because we lack individuality, but because we're inherently social beings designed to align with the norms of our tribes. This reality doesn't change regardless of how much we might wish it would. Doesn't alter no matter how strong we believe ourselves to be. Doesn't shift regardless of how independent we imagine ourselves to be. The only question is whether we'll deliberately choose the tribe that pulls us upward, or passively accept whatever surroundings happen to exist around us, with their inevitable gravitational pull toward whatever level of mediocrity has become the new normal. The uncommon man chooses deliberately, selects carefully, connects strategically with those few who will strengthen rather than weaken his resistance against the downward pull, who will support rather than undermine his commitment to possibility over convenience, who will reinforce rather than erode his dedication to excellence, regardless of collapsing standards in the world around him. This doesn't mean complete isolation from those who haven't made the same choices. Doesn't require total separation from the broader culture with its settling standards and diminishing expectations. But it does demand creating sufficient insulation through intentional connection with the uncommon few, that the downward pull doesn't gradually, invisibly erode your own standards, until you wake up one day to discover you've become what you once recognized as mediocre, but now accept as normal. With this tribal reinforcement established, the uncommon man advances to the fourth essential element of rising above mediocrity in an age of collapsing standards, mastering what others abandon. In every era of declining standards, certain skills, disciplines, and competencies get left behind. Certain capacities, capabilities, and proficiencies get dropped from what's expected, required, or even recognized as valuable. These abandoned excellences create extraordinary opportunity for the uncommon man. Because what most have forgotten, neglected, or dismissed still holds tremendous power when mastered, applied, and leveraged in a world where such masteries have become increasingly rare. Look at what's being abandoned in our current age. Deep focus in an era of constant distraction. Genuine craftsmanship in a time of mass production. Patient development in a culture of instant gratification, earned authority in a world of unqualified opinion, personal responsibility in an environment of perpetual victimhood, delayed gratification in a system built on immediate consumption, physical capability in an increasingly virtual existence, face-to-face courage in a landscape of anonymous criticism. Each abandoned excellence represents both a symptom of our collapsing standards and an opportunity for those willing to master what others have forgotten or never bothered to learn. The uncommon man doesn't rage against these cultural shifts, doesn't waste energy in pointless nostalgia for bygone eras, doesn't expend precious focus on criticizing the abandonment of what was once common knowledge or expected capability. Instead, he gets quietly to work, mastering precisely what others are forgetting, developing exactly what others are neglecting, owning completely what others are abandoning as irrelevant, unnecessary, or too demanding for modern sensibilities. And in this mastery of the abandoned, he finds leverage that borders on the unfair, advantage that approaches the unreasonable, impact that verges on the unseemly when measured against those who've surrendered these capabilities in exchange for whatever passing fashion or momentary convenience captured their limited attention. Because here's what most miss in an age obsessed with the new, the next, the novel. What endures across time usually does so for good reason. What remains valuable across generations typically does so because it connects to something fundamental in human existence. What maintains its power across centuries frequently does so because it taps into unchanging realities about who we are and how the world actually works beyond our current cultural fashion or technological distraction. The uncommon man recognizes this truth, leverages this reality, builds his distinctiveness not just on doing the common things uncommonly well, but on mastering the uncommon things that once were common before standards began their steady collapse into what we now celebrate as normal. With these abandoned excellences incorporated into his growing uncommonness, he then implements the fifth essential element of rising above mediocrity, building the unshakable core. Look beneath the surface behaviors and visible achievements of any truly uncommon man, and you'll find something that often goes unrecognized or unnamed. An internal foundation so solid that external chaos cannot destabilize it. A personal center so grounded that cultural confusion cannot disorient it. A moral compass so fixed that social pressure cannot redirect it. This unshakable core doesn't develop automatically, doesn't emerge without intention, doesn't form without deliberate cultivation through specific practices that most have abandoned in our rush toward whatever comes easiest or feels most immediately satisfying. What practices build this core? What disciplines develop this foundation? What commitments create this stability? The specifics vary across individuals, but certain elements appear consistently among those who've successfully built an unshakable core in times of collapsing standards. Regular solitude that allows deep introspection beyond the noise of constant social input and perpetual digital distraction. Define principles that establish clear boundaries between what will and won't be compromised, regardless of convenience, opportunity, or social approval. consistent discipline that develops the capacity to do what needs doing regardless of fluctuating motivation or passing emotional states. Purposeful discomfort that builds resilience against the inevitable challenges that accompany any meaningful pursuit of excellence in a world that prioritizes ease above all. Historical perspective that provides context beyond the momentary hysteria, passing passion, or current obsession dominating those trapped entirely within the narrow confines of present fashion. Transcendent connection to something beyond the material, beyond the self, beyond the immediate that anchors decisions in soil deeper than shifting cultural trends or personal preference. Together, these core-building practices create internal stability so rare in our age of collapsing standards that it alone would set you apart even without the other elements of uncommonness, would make you distinctive even without the additional aspects of rising above mediocrity, would mark you as different even without the supplementary dimensions of defying the downward pull. Because in a world where most are blown about by whatever wind happens to be blowing strongest at the moment, the man with an unshakable core becomes both mystery and magnet, both enigma and example of what's possible when internal reality is built on something more substantial than social approval, passing pleasure, or cultural conformity. With this unshakable core established, the uncommon man advances to the sixth and culminating element of rising above mediocrity in an age of collapsing standards, pursuing worthy purpose beyond self-satisfaction. Look at the lives of truly uncommon men across history and across cultures, and a pattern emerges so consistently that it cannot be dismissed as coincidence or correlation. They've dedicated themselves to purposes larger than personal comfort, individual achievement, or private gain. This isn't about grand, world-changing missions that make history books, though sometimes such callings emerge. It isn't about famous contributions that transform entire fields, though occasionally such impacts develop. It isn't about recognized innovations that reshape industries, though periodically such breakthroughs occur. It's about orienting your existence around something more significant than your own momentary happiness, passing pleasure, or personal advancement. About anchoring your decisions in purpose that transcends self-interest, outlasts individual lifetime, and contributes to realities larger than private experience. In an age where self-fulfillment has become the ultimate goal, self-expression the highest value, and self-satisfaction the final arbiter of what's worth doing, this dedication to worthy purpose beyond the self represents perhaps the most countercultural aspect of becoming truly uncommon, because it involves voluntary submission of your immediate preferences, passing interests, and personal conveniences to something you recognize as more important than your own comfort, more significant than your own advancement, more meaningful than your own pleasure. This submission isn't weakness, isn't surrender, isn't diminishment of your strength, capability, or agency. It's the ultimate expression of personal power, the capacity to subordinate smaller desires to larger purposes, to subjugate momentary impulses to enduring values, to subdue passing whims to permanent principles that transcend individual lifetime and connect to human realities larger than personal experience. The uncommon man doesn't pursue worthy purpose to appear virtuous, gain social approval, or accumulate moral status in the eyes of others. He commits to causes beyond himself because he's discovered what those trapped in perpetual self-focus never realize. that we find our greatest fulfillment, not in direct pursuit of our own satisfaction, but in dedication to purposes that deserve our highest contribution. This worthy purpose varies widely across individuals. For some, it centers on family legacy that extends beyond personal lifetime. For others, it focuses on community contribution that strengthens what they've received for those who will follow. For still others, it involves creative work that adds beauty, understanding, or capability to human experience beyond their own existence. The specific expression matters less than the fundamental orientation, toward impact that outlasts individual life, toward contribution that transcends personal gain, toward purpose worthy of the uncommon capability developed through all previous elements of rising above mediocrity in an age of collapsing standards. Together, these 6 elements upward focus rather than sideways comparison, daily defiance of the downward pull, finding your uncommon few, mastering what others abandon, building the unshakable core, and pursuing worthy purpose beyond self-satisfaction, create the complete path of the uncommon man in an age of collapsing standards. This path isn't for everyone, isn't suited to all temperaments, isn't aligned with every individual's deepest desires or natural inclinations. And that's precisely the point. In a world increasingly designed to accommodate the easiest path, the lowest common denominator, the least demanding standard, those who choose the uncommon way will always be the minority. Will always represent the exception rather than the rule, will always stand out precisely because they've refused to be defined by what's become normal, expected, or acceptable. The only question remaining is whether you'll join their ranks, whether you'll make the decision that begins the journey, whether you'll embrace the first step that initiates the process of becoming truly uncommon in an age that celebrates, rewards, and normalizes mediocrity as the new standard for what's considered good enough. The choice stands before you now, as it always has, as it always will. Will you sink to the new normal, or will you rise to become the uncommon man? The answer isn't found in your words, your intentions, or your momentary inspiration while considering the question. It's written in your next decision, and the one after that, and the thousands that follow, accumulating day by day into either uncommon excellence or comfortable mediocrity, depending not on what you say, but on what you consistently do when faced with the constant choice between upward path and downward pull. Choose well, choose consciously, choose as if your legacy depends upon it,